So can we start now?
Okay.
Okay. Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi will be joining with us after, I think, 3 o'clock because he still have a class. Ya, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Alhamdulillah wassalatu ala rasulillah sayyidina Muhammadin ibn Abdullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Good afternoon everyone, all participants, ladies and gentlemen. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati. This is the second panel of our international conference on Muslim society and thoughts. Yesterday we have discussed some topic with Professor Masdal Hirmi from UIN Sunan Ampel, Professor Anis Malik Toha from UNISA Brunei Darussalam, and Dr. Wan Fariza from University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Today, our participants, we have 3 outstanding speakers as well to learn and discuss several topics related to Indonesian Islamic literature and Muslim tradition in Indonesia. First is Professor Johanna Ping. She is with us now in the room from University Sumanto Al-Qurtubi, a professor at King Fahd University of Petroleum and Mineral, Saudi Arabia. And the third is Professor Bianto from State Islamic University, UIN Sunan Ampel, Surabaya. I think all presenters have been here in this room, except for Sumanto, that I thought before because he still has a class and will be joining with us later. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, this panel will be run within next 2 years, inshallah, and will be divided into 2 sessions. The first session is the presentation of the speakers, where each speaker will have around 30 minutes to deliver presentation. And the second session is Q&A session, is around 30 minutes. So we have 2 hours. And all participants are pleased to write your question in chat room or deliver directly the question of the all presentation of all speakers. Baik Bapak Ibu, now let's start our panel today with the first presentation from Professor Johanna Ping. She will deliver her talk on reconstructing the Quran meaning in Indonesia, though on Javanese Tafsir and Quran translation. I think this topic is very interesting. But let me introduce and read a short biography of Johanna Ping before her presentation. Johanna Ping is Professor of Islamic Studies at the University of Freiburg, Germany. She also gives a lecture at Freie Universität Berlin and the University of Tübingen. Her main field of interest are the trans-regional history of tafsir in the modern period and Quran translation, with a particular focus on trans-regional dynamic. She is the principal investigator of the research project, The Global Quran, and general editor in the Encyclopedia of the Quran Online. Her most recent monograph is Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today, 2019. Beside her other publications, such as Classical Quranic Hermeneutics in Oxford Handbook of Quranic Studies, 2020, Tafsir as Discourse, Institution, Norm, and Authority in a book, Deconstruction Islamic Studies, 2020, and Muslim Quranic Interpretation Today, Media, Genealogies, and Interpretive Communities, 2019, and other publications. So, Professor Johanna Ping, time is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind invitation and the introduction. I've brought a presentation and let me share my screen. Okay, does this work? Do you see the presentation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. So a few years ago, I've worked on Javanese Quran translations and Tafsir. And the initial reason why I did this was because I was interested in the difference between the Javanese language and Arabic. As you probably all know, Javanese is a language that has very refined levels of politeness, which isn't the case with Arabic. In Arabic, it's basically like there's one level, and for example, if God speaks, then you use the verb kala, and if a human speaks, you use the verb kala. It's just always kala, and in Javanese, you don't do that. You have words that express humility and high status and so on. So this is the initial reason I was starting to study Javanese tafsir works and Quran translation. But then I became very interested in seeing how this also shows us different translation practices, different practices of reconstructing the meaning of the Quran in a specific language and in a specific context. And I'm going to share some of these thoughts with you. So why am I even using the word Quran? So this, yeah, that's that. So why am I even using the word translation when talking of this? Because usually these Javanese works call themselves tafsir. So, well, if you understand translation very fundamentally as the act of reconstructing or reproducing a meaning in a different language, then every non-Arabic tafsir involves translation on some level. But of course, very often that's different from the kind of thing we are used to see when we say Quran translation. So what we are used to is usually something like this. So on the left, you see a Javanese translation of Muhammad Ali's The Holy Quran. It's an Ahmadiyya work that was published in 1917 in English. And it was one of the first Muslim Quran translations, not really the first, but one of the early ones anyway. And it was actually a model that a lot of later translations followed, including, interestingly, the Indonesian Ministry of Religion in the initial versions in many ways, not in all ways, but in many ways. So, and what is characteristic of these translations is that they try to follow the semantics and the structure of the Arabic Quran very closely and come across as somehow like objective translations where the translator is made invisible. So this is a notion that has also been discussed in translation studies as a concept of translation that was made popular in the modern period in Europe, especially in connection with biblical translation. So the idea is that you have a kind of a translation that is an exact and objective equivalent of the source text, and you don't really see the opinions or the language or any kind of personal influence of the translator. So that's the aim. And while everybody acknowledges that it's probably not possible to reach this aim perfectly, it's still what translators are trying to do. And it's also what usually informs discourses of translation. And when we talk about good translations, bad translations, so the question is always, how can we kind of get this direct access to the source text without any interference from the translator? Okay, and so when I started working on Quran translation, this was also implicitly my idea of what a Quran translation looks like, because this idea is just universally acknowledged. I think it's also implicitly present in the Indonesian discourses on Tarjama harfiya, Tajama ma'nawiya, etc. And then I started looking at Javanese works, and what I'm going to focus on in this talk is especially one genre of Javanese tafsir, namely the Kitab Kuning, which of course means tafsir works that are used in schools, pedagogy. And one of the reasons why this is interesting is that actually a lot of tafsir works are linked to pedagogy in some ways. So they are actually teaching texts. Maybe they are old teaching texts. I mean, a lot of the classical Arabic tafsirs maybe were used like 700 years ago in madrasas, but they are still teaching texts. And I think we, in Tafsir studies in general, we need to think more about what that means. And one of the things that it means is that the teacher always has a very central role. So you have a teacher who is teaching these texts. And how can you make a teacher who is so important to this text invisible? It's really not possible. And this is what you see in these Kitab Kuning texts. So I basically looked at two of them. This is Al-Ibris and the other one is Al-Iqlil. So I have them here. The authors were brothers, Bisri Mustafa and Misbah Zain Mustafa. It's maybe also important to note that these works are not exactly recent. So it's, I think Al-Ibris was like the 1950s and Al-Iqlil was the 1970s. So at this time, also the level of registers and politeness and so on involved in the Javanese language was probably a lot higher than it is today. And it's much more pronounced in Al-Ibris than in Al-Iqlil. One of the models that we might think about before we look more closely at what these exegetes are doing in their tafsir works is the Tafsir al-Jalalain, because the Tafsir al-Jalalain is really the teaching text. It's also, whoops, somebody is painting on my screen. That's not me. Anyway, the Tafsir al-Jalalain is basically, it's the most important teaching text in Pesantren in Arabic. And it's probably behind a lot of, I mean, it's probably in some way behind all pedagogical tafsir. So whoever did these red lines, I can't remove them. They are not mine. Anyway, so what the Tafsir al-Jalalain is doing is basically it takes the Arabic text and inserts some clarification and explanation. So for example, this is a very famous beginning of Surah Yusuf. إذ قال يوسف لأبيه يا أبي يا أبتي إني رأيت أحد عشر كوكبا والشمس والقمر رأيتهم لي ساجدين. So the Tafsir al-Jalalain more or less repeats this with some additional explanation. Mention when Joseph said to his father Jacob, so the names are usually inserted because the Quran very often does not mention the names of the speakers and of the addressees. Oh, my father, and then there's a bit of grammatical explanation. Why is this Abati and not Abi or Abuya or something? Verily, I saw in my dream 11 stars and the sun and the moon. I saw them, which is repeated for affirmation. So this is another explanation on syntax. Bow down before me. And then you have another explanation. In this case, why is the Arabic plural form used for the sun and the moon and so on, even though these, I mean, the sun and the moon and the stars are not animate. So usually it should be ra'aytaha and not ra'aytahum. So things like these are explained. And now, wait a moment. So yeah, and this is another example from the story of Abraham. And here you can see that the Tafsir al-Jalalain sometimes also very briefly inserts some stories. Like in this case, Abraham talks to someone and this someone says, like, who is this God? And is this God really better than me? And then he says, I too give life and death. And then the Tafsir al-Jalalain explains that this person kills or pardons people and demonstrate this by calling two men and killing one of them and showing that he has power over life and death. Okay, so in the Tafsir al-Jalalain, this is basically all in one running text. In the Kitab Kuning, the structure is much more explicit. So what you have here is three parts usually. The first part is the interlinear translation, where you have the Arabic Quran, and in between the lines, you have it explained word for word. Then you have a paraphrase, a bit like the Tafsir al-Jalalain, but in Javanese. So essentially the meaning of the verses is narrated. And in the bottom section, you have some commentary, which could include, for example, something like the story about this king who killed the two men that I just had in this verse related to Abraham. So this is a very clear structure. And the first part, I'm not going to say much about it because, well, many of you are probably familiar with it anyway. When I give this presentation to people who have no experience with the Indonesian context, they are usually very, interested to see how this works. So this is again the beginning of Surat Yusuf, and I try to translate this word for word translation, which is called Gandul. And what you can see here is it contains the meaning of the Arabic words, and it also contains some grammatical information. So for example, it's indicated whether something is the subject, like Yusuf, for example. It's not just, the translation doesn't just say Yusuf, but it says Sopo Yusuf, and Sopo signifies it's the subject, and so on. So it's very close to the text, and it's basically meant to help students understand the meaning of the Arabic text. So it doesn't work without the Arabic text at all. The second part, the paraphrase, does work without the Arabic text. So you could theoretically just read the middle part and learn about it, the meaning of the Quran. Here you have, here this is the part that I focused on in my research actually, because here you have the meaning of the Quran basically reconstructed in the voice of the Qiyai, the teacher who is teaching this. Here you can see that this verse about, no, this is not about Yaqub. Sorry, there's a mistake in the first line of the English translation. It's actually the prophet Yaqub, not Joseph. He's worried about letting Yusuf go out with his brothers. And Al-Ibris explains this very extensively. Son, verily, I'm worried about letting you go and take Joseph, and I'm concerned that Joseph might be devoured by a wild dog. So this is the translation of dhib, the Arabic word dhib, which is an animal that doesn't really exist on Java. So you have to explain it somehow, because that area is well known for its many wild dogs. And maybe you will not take good care of him, given that your brother is still so young. So it's basically the meaning of the Arabic, but with a lot more information and also with a lot more emotion. So we learn more about the motives of the characters, which in the Quranic account are often missing, because the Quran basically assumes that the audience knows the story. So very often you have this reference to a story, and it's clear from the way in which the Quran talks about it that they assume the listeners know what's going on. And of course the Qiyai would have to explain it because some of the students wouldn't know. So an interesting bit in Al-Iqlil, which I liked very much, here he translates adhib by tiger. So he says, I'm afraid that Joseph will be eaten by a tiger when you are forgetful, which is kind of nice because, well, you don't have wolves on Java, but you used to have tigers. I mean, you don't anymore, I think, but they used to be there. So that's actually what Javanese children might be able to relate to when there's talk about being afraid of wild animals. So what you have here is a reconstruction of the meaning in the Qiyai's voice in a specific social setting, which is the social setting of Javanese culture. So what I focused on then in my study of Javanese tafsir is dialogue, because when you have the Quran present some dialogue between different characters, this is a place where you would have to employ the social hierarchies of the Javanese language. So the question is, would these people talk to each other politely or impolitely? And what is the hierarchy between them? Are they on the same rank, or are they like one person above, one person below? So one example that I found very interesting is the story of the Annunciation of Jesus. So when the angel comes to Maryam and tells her that she's going to have a son. So we have these lines where Mary and the angel talk to each other. And it starts with Mary, قالت إني أعوذ برحمن منك إن كنت تقيا. And then he talks back to Mary and says, like, I'm a messenger from your Lord, and I'm bringing you the news of a boy. And she says, she talks back, how could I have a boy if no man has touched me, and so on. So then this is translated into Javanese, and here I have the example of Al-Ibris. So as you can see, the Javanese translation is a bit longer than, for example, the English translation I have chosen here, which means it gives a bit more information. You also see this, that the author uses brackets several times to give additional information. And if you look what register he uses, then you can see this, which is very interesting. So Mary starts talking to the angel in Ngoko, which is the basic level, which is not very polite. So she talks to the angel as if he's some strange guy who is coming to harass her, which is exactly what is happening here. So she doesn't know who he is. She thinks, oh my God, leave me alone, go away. So then the angel talks back to her also in Ngoko, which is not very respectful because he's an angel. I mean, and she's just human. So that's okay. And then suddenly she switches to Krama. So suddenly when she talks back to the angel, she becomes very respectful. And this signifies, without adding any explanation, that she has accepted the claim of the angel, because otherwise she wouldn't suddenly start talking politely to him. And the Quran doesn't actually say this, but so just the use of Krama or Ngoko can give an interpretive dimension that wasn't there in the Arabic Quran. And it's actually kind of unavoidable if you use Javanese with all the registers, because there's no neutral ground. I mean, you can't just, there's no register that doesn't signify some kind of social relationship. So this is actually what I was mostly looking for in my work on these Javanese tafsirs. And what they usually do, I mean, there are some differences between these works. And I looked at 5 or 6 all in all, not just at the 2 I'm talking about today. But what they usually are doing is they use Ngoko in the normal text of the Quran. So when there's no specific dialogue, because this is God talking to humans. And then for the para text, which means like footnotes and introduction, most of the exegetes use Krama, because in this case, it's the author addressing the readers. So it's more polite, because obviously a human author talking to his esteemed readers would be more polite than God when he's talking to humans. And in Quranic dialogue, it's totally depending on the social situation, especially in the paraphrase where the Kiai tells the story in his own voice. So just a very brief overview of the situations I looked at. So different situations involving different kinds of people and also different genders, some women, angels, and in the story with Solomon, even birds and jinn. So very, very diverse characters. And basically all this, I mean, in terms of language, it's more interesting than looking at any instances where God talks to people, because God is always on top of the hierarchy. I mean, that's like so obvious, you don't really have to research it. And what you can find if you look at Javanese tafsir works and translations is that there are some areas where they come across status problems or ambiguities, so where it's not entirely clear to the exegetes what the hierarchy is. One of these status problems involves gender, because very often women are talked to in Ngoko, even when they have a high social standing. I mean, for example, Zuleika and Yusuf, a lot of exegetes have Yusuf talk to Zulekha in Ngoko, even when he's still a slave and she's actually his mistress. So you're kind of wondering when you read this how they actually imagine this social situation, or if they see it from the end result, where obviously Yusuf in the end has a higher status than her, but in the beginning he doesn't. Or if they view it from the fact that he's a prophet and she's not. So this is also a consideration. This is religious status. So sometimes there's a clash between religious and social status of a person. For example, you can see when Yusuf talks to his father, he's always very polite. But then, of course, his father is also a prophet. So he's a prophet and his father is a prophet, but his father is older. So obviously he talks to him very politely. But when Abraham talks to his father, it's a bit more ambiguous because the father is older and he's the father, but he's also an idolater, and Abraham is a believer and a prophet. So some exegetes treat these situations differently. And then, of course, as I showed you, you have completely unfamiliar situations, like when you're talking to angels. This doesn't usually happen in a Javanese cultural context, so you have to do something, or when people are talking to animals or jinn. So registers, registers is the linguistic term for things like ngoko and kromo, so different levels of speech. This requires the exegete to assess or to construct a social situation. So sometimes the social situation in which the dialogue in the Quran is set is really not clear. So the exegete has to do something and to fill in this gap. And then the choice of register can also be an exegetical technique to, for example, to designate a specific audience. Sometimes in the Quran, you don't know who the person is talking to. So you just know that somebody is talking, but you don't know who the audience is. For example, is he talking to God, or is he talking to his son, or is he talking to somebody else? And then the choice of ngoko or krama can indicate what the exegete thinks is actually happening here. Or it can also designate a change in speaker or audience. And this, again, sometimes in the Quran, it's not clear because you don't have punctuation. So in the Arabic Quran, you don't have quotation marks. So sometimes you don't know when the speech ends, or you don't know if the speech changes between one speaker and another. And you can use the change of register to designate this. Or as I have shown in the example of Al-Ibris and the dialogue between Mary and the angel, you can also use it to designate that the social context has changed. So Mary has recognized that this person talking to her is actually superior. Okay, so all this is, why is all this relevant? I mean, what is it adding to our understanding of tafsir? I think it's relevant because it's something we don't learn from looking at Arabic tafsir. Because Arabic tafsir, because it addresses problems that Arabic tafsir doesn't have to solve. So there's some level of ambiguity in the Quranic text. For example, we don't know exactly who's speaking. We don't know exactly what the social relationship is between these people. But for the Arabic exegetes, this is not really a problem because they don't have to address this or resolve this. But in Javanese, the difference between languages forces the translator or exegete to resolve this, to make some decision, to make some choice. Is it kromo, is it ngoko? And what does it mean if I choose kromo, for example? And this shows us ambiguities in the Quranic text that we wouldn't realize even if we just looked at Arabic sources. And this is why I think that, one of the many reasons why I think that exegetical activity in languages other than Arabic can be very, very interesting also for our understanding of the Quran, not just for tafsir and for understanding tafsir itself. The other thing that got me thinking about, as I said in the beginning, is are we talking about tafsir or are we talking about translation here? And is it really even possible to separate these two activities? And so first of all, I think nowadays when I'm talking about translation, I always distinguish between translation as a genre, as a very particular type of text, versus translation as a practice. So when I talk about translation as a genre, I can limit this to the kind of translation I have shown in the beginning. For example, the Indonesian Ministry of Religion translation, the translation where the translator tries to stay invisible. When I talk about translation as a practice, I have to look much more broadly. What kind of practices do we have in a particular language, in a particular culture, to represent and reconstruct the Quran's meaning in a different language? And then I can come to the result that actually what these Kitab Kuning are doing is in a way a very, maybe not accurate, but very faithful and honest way of translating the Quran. Because first of all, it is so clearly structured. You have a clear distinction between the grammatical translation, the narrative translation, and the commentary. So you can take out the commentary, and then you have two types of translation. But in these two types of translation, you still have very clearly the translator's or exegete's voice. So there's no attempt to hide that or to disguise it or to make it invisible. And this is actually very honest, because this is always the case. In every translation, we actually have the translator's voice. They are just trying to hide it and pretend it's not there and pretend it's an objective representation of the meaning. And in this case, we have the Kiai's voice so clearly that there's no pretense. So it's totally clear who's talking here. So yeah, this is actually, you have the Arabic Quran, and then you have these two types of translation in the Kiai's voice. And this is actually what I would consider a faithful translation. And so this is why I think that the study of Javanese Kitab Kuning can help us question notions of faithful translation or of equivalence or of the invisible translator that are very, very common in translation theory, and that are not representative of what translation can look like or should look like. They can also help us realize that there's not, or like question the notion that Quran translation or tafsir is always a written and published definitive text, because we also have very many examples of texts that are the product of continuous oral tradition. And this is also true for classical Arabic tafsir. So very often we actually have a manuscript tradition, and there are several versions and they have differences between them. And very often we don't see that in today's printed editions, because the editor has chosen one manuscript and edited that. But it's actually in the background of the whole process of tafsir, because these texts were teaching texts. And finally, as I've shown in the study of register, it can also help us question Arabic-centered assessments of the Quran, especially of ambiguity and unambiguousness of the Quran. Which is why I think the study of non-Western languages and also of marginalized and non-official languages can be very, very instructive, because it can show us a much broader range of translation practices and also of ways to approach and interpret and understand the Quran that are sometimes simply a product of the differences between this language and the Arabic language. But they are also a product of a particular setting, for example, a pedagogical setting. So thank you very much for your attention.
Ustaz Siddiq.
Okay, was that so boring? He left.
Moderator, hello. Hello, moderator. In Germany, what's time now for Joanna?
9:30. So it's morning. Yeah.
Morning, yes.
Yeah.
I have attended in international meeting in Münster. And
okay.
Yeah. In August 20 and 17.
This year?
Yeah, hosted by San Egidio community based on Roma. Yes.
Okay, great. Münster is nice.
Münster, yes, a beautiful city.
Yeah.
Yeah, very clean.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I hope I can come to Surabaya at some point, but at the moment it's not such a good time for traveling. So.
Oh, please come to Surabaya.
Yeah, so Ahmed Siddiq.
Where is Ahmed Siddiq?
I don't know if he lost his internet connection or something, but he seems to be completely gone. Or maybe you just start and hope he will be back. I don't know.
Yeah. Or I do a presentation, or I don't know, yes.
I don't know either, but you're the next person, right?
Yes.
So I really don't know what happened.
Bapak Ibu panitia, apakah bisa dibantu Mas Siddiq, barangkali ada masalah? Pak Dekan, Wakil Dekan. How we continue this conference, or hello? Pak Hasan, silakan Pak Hasan. Dilanjut Pak Hasan. I think Mr. Hasan continue this discussion of Joanna.
Okay.
Mr. Hasan, please. Hello. Okay.
I think he was supposed to come later or something, or is he there already?
Okay.
Ahmed Siddiq just came back, I think.
Okay, I think I continue presentation, Rosiana, never mind. Okay.
I don't mind, I'm finished. I'm not the moderator.
Okay, Prof. Johanna and all participants, I try continue this session with my presentation. Okay. I want to try share screen. Okay, Prof. Johanna from the University of Freiburg, Germany, and Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi from Department of Global and Social Studies, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, Saudi Arabia. I think in shortly he will join with us in virtual meeting. And moderator, Dr. Ahmad Siddiq, and all participants of the Third International Conference of Muslim Society and Thoughts, ICMAS 20 and 21. Fully, I have written full paper for this conference. I hope you read in the proceedings to be published by Usuluddin and Philosophy Faculty in the near future. And now I will present the main ideas that I have written in I think in less than 30 minutes, because for me 30 minutes is very, very long for me. Okay. Okay, I have written with title Religious Moderation in Pandemic Era. I think this topic is very important because we all still in pandemic era now. The first, in my introduction, we should not be a stammer to respond the pandemic era. I mean, a stammer is gagap, yeah, gagap or hukum to respond to pandemic era. Even this should not occur among the religious leaders. I mean, ulama and Islamic scholars, or the elite of religious organizations like Muhammadiyah, NU, Majelis Ulama Indonesia, and so on. The majority of ulama support the policy of controlling the pandemic. They see that the policy is a part of efforts to practice religious teachings about the importance of keeping the soul safe. In Quranic, the same with hifdun nafas. Wala tulqu bi aydikum ila tahlukah wa ahsinu innallaha yuhibbul muhsinin. There are religious groups with fatalistic views who always state that life, death, hurt, sickness, and fortune are God's fate. And I think it is a very dangerous views. Yeah. They also criticize the fatwas of ulama and religious organizations that call the ummah to worship at home, and those who follow at fatwa that the mosque should be closed during the pandemic era, even they are said to be paranoid. Ministry of Religious Affairs include the policy of the religious moderation into the next, the National Midterm Development Plan, RPJMN in Indonesia, rancangan pembangunan jangka menengah, yes. Namely is Luqman Hakim Saifuddin. I think you all introduce him, yes. Religious and scientific approach are needed in tackling the pandemic era. I think I hope we have the same understanding in this approach here. Religious and scientific must above anything in tackling the pandemic era. Based on the background, the question is, how are the views of religious leaders regarding religious moderation and its implementation in the pandemic era? Part 2, moderation and historical context. In the context of religious practices, moderation means religious thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors taking a position in the middle. In Islamic tradition, moderation, the meaning wasatiyatul Islam, wasatiyah Islam. In the West, with majority and minority Muslim, wasatiyah Islam is very prominent. The Quranic explicitly forbids excessive attitudes in religion. Qul ya ahlal kitab la taghlu fi dinikum ghairal haq. And Prophet Muhammad said, iyyakum wal ghulu fid din fa innama ahlaka man kana qablakum al ghulu fid din. And in historical perspective, one of the ulama, namely Ibn Taymiyyah, introduced moderation through his work, the title Al-Aqidah Al-Wasitiyah, the Creed of Al-Wasitiyah. And now we see several works in the books of Hasim Kamali and Joseph L. Esposito. Hasim Kamali stated the concept of wasatiyah in the Quran as the spirit of the religious moderation, either the one dealing with thoughts, attitudes, and behaviors. Kamali also used the term wasatiyah Islam to mention a moderate position between two extreme points. And John L. Esposito means a moderate Muslim as a progressive or liberal Muslim. The concept of a moderate Muslim is distinguished from a conservative, traditional, and fundamentalist one. We continue. Haidar Nasir, head of Central of Muhammadiyah. Moderation is as a middle way to encounter all problems, especially religious one. Moderation is related to the characteristics of development and modernity. In the Moderasi Beragama, published by Ministry of Religious Affairs, moderation means a middle part of middle way or middle, something existing between two bad characteristics. For example, brave is considered to be good because it is located between being careless and being afraid. This also becomes the case for being generous, which is a good manner since it is between being lavish and stingy. And we see the fatwa of the Council of Indonesian Ulama. There are 12 principles of moderation or wasatiyah Islam, namely moderate, balance, just, tolerance, deliberation, modernity, thinking priority, dynamic and innovative, civilized, loving homeland, and becoming pioneers. And the other views, we see the core message about Satya Islam. There are 7 principles: tawazun, iktidal, tasamuh, syura, islah, al-qudwah, and al-muwatanah. And in the pandemic era, I see that the Ummah realize the teaching of religious moderation with 5 forms. Number 1, worshiping at home. Worshiping at home. During the pandemic era, scholars from various religious organizations, such as the Council of Indonesian Ulama, Muhammadiyah, and Nahdlatul Ulama, had almost the same view. This organization called on the people living in dangerous areas, zona merah or red zones, to worship at home. Those are the Traweh prayers, obligatory prayers 5 times a day, Friday prayers or Jum'ah prayers, and other worship conducted together are advised not to be performed in mosque and musaf. Even Eidaini, namely Eidul Adha and Eidul Fitri, which are usually held lively in mosque or church, are also not allowed. Prayers for these 2 holidays are recommended to be carried out together at home with family. Number 2, working and studying from home. Along with the government's policy on social restrictions during the pandemic era, everyone should also limit activities outside at home. It is for this reason that the government and private agencies regulate work activities in a different way of working from home. WFH, WFH, the pandemic condition has started showing signs of sloping. Then a scheme is arranged, is a blended system, which is a combination of work from home and work from office, WFH and WFO. Not only for work, in education, policies are also set, namely study from home until now. The starting from home policy start from the beginning of the COVID-19 case in middle of March 2020 until July 20 and 21. Until now, yeah, right at the time of entering the new endemic years 20 and 21 or 20 and 22. This policy shows the importance of placing the safety of educators and students as a priority. And number 3, awareness of taking part in vaccination. It is important, and I think we all have been vaccinated, yes. As part of controlling the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has launched a vaccination program. Vaccination is an effort to create immunity to certain diseases like COVID-19, so that it can prevent disability or death. The vaccination program is supported by various parties, including religious organizations. From a religious perspective, vaccination as Azumardi Azra said, is part of the character of religious moderation. The acceptance of religious people to the vaccination program because it considers personal and life safety. Hifdun nafas. Through the vaccine, a person is expected to have immunity so that he is not easily exposed to the coronavirus. The fourth, social ta'awun or philanthropy. The practice of philanthropy and voluntarism presented through a number of religious organizations such as Muhammadiyah and Nahdlatul Ulama. There was the Muhammadiyah COVID-19 Command Center, namely MC3. Muhammadiyah has donated trillions of rupiah during the pandemic season, the pandemic era. The MC3 also helps COVID-19 patients regardless of social, religious, and ethnic backgrounds. This shows that the values of generosity citizens have been entrenched in Indonesia. And in my presentations, there is no. Hello? And yes. The practice of this philanthropic teaching has also been appreciated worldwide. This can be seen from the result of a survey conducted by the Charity Aid Foundation, CAF, published in mid-June 20 and 21. In a survey entitled World Giving Index 20 and 21, placed Indonesia as the most generous country in the world. What is proud is because this achievement was raised in the midst of the pandemic era. And the last of my presentation, worshipping virtuality. During the pandemic era, there were also unique and interesting religious phenomena observed. The religious phenomenon is virtual worship. Virtual worship. Virtual worship is carried out by people in various forms, such as tahlilan virtual, takziah virtual, recitation and tadarus Quran, Eid Fitri together, Eid Al-Adha together, and so on. Virtual worship activities has also penetrated into various types of religious rituals, among them of Eid prayers, Idul Adha, Idul Fitri, Tarawih prayers, and even Friday prayers until now. Virtual worship seems to be an alternative way for some people in the midst of limitation and emergencies due to the COVID-19 emergency. I think the five phenomena is very interesting as how the Ummah relies religious moderation in the real life. I think I finished my presentation and I back the time to moderator. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Pak Bianto. Is my voice is clear?
Yes.
So sorry because I was banned for several minutes and I got a bad connection attack from the alliance. Okay, thank you for Professor Johanna Ping. Thank you to Professor Bianto. We have learned a lot of insight, and we got a lot of insight from the speakers. From Professor Johanna Ping, we have learned the connection between Javanese culture and the Quran translation in Indonesia, and also the structure of the Kitab Kuning on Tafsir Al-Quran or Quranic exegesis, and also the use of Javanese language in Quranic translation, which is Ngoko or grammar. And from Prof. Bianto, we have learned to look at the Muslim society and Islamic phenomena in Indonesia during the pandemic COVID-19. Just to inform you, the speakers, our audience today is also mahasiswa S1 undergraduate student. So I think if I don't know, I'm not sure that whether Professor Johanna can speak in Bahasa or Jawa, yeah, because it will be more understandable to the audience, to the undergraduate student. Could you speak
not really,
Bahasa?
to be honest, no, not really. I mean, I can understand. Okay. I can mostly read, but I can't really speak
okay.
that well without preparation. That's like.
Okay, thank you. Tapi teman-teman, mungkin the audience, if you want to ask a question to Professor Johanna Ping by using Bahasa, just write it in chat room. Probably we can translate into English, and or Professor Johanna understand your question because she also can read Bahasa, but it's not easy for her to speak in Bahasa. We are still waiting for Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi. Hello, Professor Sumanto. Is he with us now? Okay, while we are waiting for Professor Sumanto, I open the question and answer session for the audience, for the participant. Just raise your hand if you want to directly speak with the speaker. And here we have some question in the chat room. Anyone is raising his or her hand, or anyone can going to speak? Baik, saya akan baca yang ada di chat room. I will read the question in the chat room. It is from Wildan Islami. For Miss Johanna, what is your opinion? First, does the culture, ideology, and theology of the author affect the translation method of Kiai Bisri Mustafa in his translation or in his tafsir? The second is, in which typology does the interpretation of Al-Ibris belong according to you? It is the first question. Is it understandable, Prof. Johanna?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay. Should I answer now or?
It's okay if
Yes,
yeah.
you can answer.
Okay, so I think the culture, ideology, and theology always affects translation. So in the case of Kiai Bisri Mustafa, I mean, he doesn't try to make a strong argument for a particular theological school or anything of that kind. So that's not the main purpose of his tafsir. But still, it's based on some understanding of the correct approach to the Quran and to Islamic theology. For example, Ash'ari theology, it's very much mainstream theological approaches in Indonesia. It's different from what, for example, a Salafi exegete would have done. It also has more narrative material that some Salafis, for example, would consider Israeliyat. So there's a big argument going on, like what kind of stories you can use in interpreting the Quran and what kind of stories you can't use and so on. And Bisri Mustafa, basically, I mean, both, also Al-Iqlil, they both use a lot of stories. And this, again, is also connected to their pedagogical aim. I mean, obviously, if you want to teach the Quran, especially to children and young people, it's easier to do this when you use stories to explain like what actually happened or what kind of situation the Quran is talking about. So the second question about the typology, I mean, that really depends on what kind of typology you use. So I'm not in love with the tafsir bil-ra'i, tafsir bil-ma'thur kind of thing, which is probably the most common typology that is used when people talk about tafsir today, because I think it's very arbitrary. So it basically depends on what you accept as authentic and legitimate sources and what you don't accept. And then if you want to refute some kind of tafsir, you say, oh, it's tafsir bil-ra'i, so it's bad. It's a very polemical kind of distinction. I mean, nobody ever says of his own tafsir, it's tafsir bil-ra'i. It's always used by others to make it look bad. So this kind of typology isn't really helpful. And I'm usually more interested in things like the function of a tafsir. And in this case, it's clearly a pedagogical tafsir. Sometimes we also have mass media tafsir, for example, or kinds of tafsir that come from preaching. Or we have kinds of tafsir that really are like written works by a scholar who wants to demonstrate like his academic expertise. So in this case, I would mostly say it's pedagogical tafsir.
Thank you, Professor. The second question is also to you from Khairul Umami. If I'm not mistaken, Khairul Umami, she is the head of Department of Al-Quran and Hadith in the Faculty of Usuluddin and Philosophy. What do you think about the difference between Tarjama and Tafsir? If you said what all about Tafsir of meaning from one language and cultural context to other language is Tafsir?
I would say that depends completely on how you define Tarjama. And so in the modern, I mean, right now in the contemporary period, especially in Indonesia, Tarjama is usually understood as meaning translation. And translation in English is usually understood as the thing I tried to address, like where you have an invisible translator and the text is presented as an equivalent of the source text. And then, of course, you have a lot of Muslims who say this is not possible with the Quran because there can be no equivalent of the Quran in any other language. So we just have the Arabic Quran and that's the word of God and I'jaz, etc. And so there cannot be a translation. And that's probably completely true if you use this definition of translation. If you understand translation as a practice in which the meaning of a text is reconstructed as a different text in a different language, which is clearly the work of the translator and not of the original author, I think then there is no problem with talking about Quran translation. And I think the original meaning of Tarjama in Arabic was actually something like this. So it was actually an attempt to explain the Arabic text to people who spoke Persian or Turkish or whatever. And it was not meant to... Sorry, my phone is doing something and I can't switch it off. Anyway, so in the original meaning of Tarjama, if you look at like texts from the Middle Ages, for example, was something that was meant to help people understand the Arabic text. So it was not meant to be a replacement for the Arabic text. So, oh, you don't need the Arabic Quran anymore. You can just use this Tarjama. That was not the meaning. So in a way, Tarjama was always a kind of tafsir. It's just a very particular type of tafsir. So it's more focused on the linguistic understanding of the source text and not so much on giving additional commentary like hadith and stories and so on. And the main difference between Tajama and Tafsir, I think, is that in Tafsir you have all this additional material, which is not so closely related to the Arabic text of the Quran, but it's more like additional information. But it's impossible to make like a clear distinction, because in most translation you have some additional information, and in most tafsir, I mean in all tafsir works that are not in Arabic, you also have a kind of translation.
Okay, thank you, Professor. I think we will continue to another question before we continue to the third presentation, because I think Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi is here joining with us. Welcome, Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi. Let me read the third question. It's about a curiosity from Nur Anissa. Why are you interested in trying to take a research like Kitab Kuning, Tafsir Jalalain, and why you take this topic?
That's a very complicated question. So why does anybody research the topics they do? So in the beginning, I mean, I've been in Islamic studies for more than 30 years now. And I chose this subject in the beginning simply because I was curious. So I wanted to learn about something that you don't normally learn about in Germany in schools and so on. I wanted to learn about languages you don't usually study. I was very fascinated with the Arabic language. I was very interested in religion in general. So it just seemed like Islamic studies was a good choice. And in the German context at that time, Islamic studies was not a religious, like it didn't expect people to be Muslim or anything. So most of the students were non-Muslim and just interested in learning the language and learning something about the religion. And of course, we have all the problems with istishraq, Orientalism, like what kind of perspective do we have on others and so on. So this is a big debate of obviously today. So yeah, and then I got interested in the Quran during my studies. I studied with Professor Wild, and he was getting very much involved, Stefan Wild. He was getting very much involved with Quranic studies. And for example, he invited Nasr Hamid Abu Zaid to give a lecture in our class. And so I got exposed to all kinds of contemporary developments. And because I was always so interested in learning languages, and I also thought like, okay, there are so many Muslims who are not Arabs, so I want to learn more about what kind of Islam they believe in and they practice, and if it's different or if it's like even in the Arab world, you have very different types of Islam, depending on whether you look at Morocco or Saudi Arabia or Syria or whatever. So already there you have a lot of differences. And I was interested in learning more. And so that's why I learned Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia. Unfortunately, I have never been able to spend a long time in Indonesia. So I've been in Indonesia several times, but it was always relatively short. So that's why I'm not so confident in actually talking Bahasa Indonesia, but I've been able to read it for a very long time. And I have a lot of Indonesian PhD students now who are working with me on different topics. And I kind of, like the last 15 years, I got specialized in Tafsir studies and increasingly also in translation studies, because I'm simply really fascinated with language and the connection between language and exegesis. So how does language affect the way in which people understand a text and interpret a text? But also, of course, in Tafsir, you always have this core, which is the Arabic Tafsir tradition. So, I mean, scholars in Indonesia, scholars in Morocco, scholars in Turkey, they also use the same texts and they use the same sources, such as the Tafsir al-Jalalain, for example. But they also have things that are particular to their language and their context. And in the modern period, I also think it has a lot to do with nation states. So Indonesia has a very strong state, which, for example, has founded a lot of UN, like universities. They have a curriculum. That curriculum determines how Tafsir studies, how Quranic studies is done in Indonesia. And it's different, for example, from the way in which it is done in Saudi Arabia or at Al-Azhar or in Turkey. And that's also something that I find very interesting. So yeah, and particularly the Kitab Kuning, I think it was like several years ago, I just felt, okay, I know Bahasa Indonesia, but it felt kind of shallow to me, superficial, to only know Bahasa Indonesia and no other language that is used and spoken in Indonesia. So I had this idea to learn Javanese, and yeah, so then I started learning Javanese, and then I wanted to do something with it. So it was a bit like, okay, now I need to study some Javanese tafsir because I've learned the language and now I want to work with some sources. So yeah.
Thank you for that nice story, Professor Johanna. Yes. Now we will open another question and answer session after the presentation from Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi as the last speaker for today. He will deliver his presentation toward public intellectual social responsibility of Muslim secular in Islamic higher education. Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi is an associate professor of anthropology in the Department of Global and Social Studies, King Fahd University of Petroleum and Minerals, Saudi Arabia. He is also director of Nusantara Institute on Culture and Religion. His research interests focus on the study of Muslim politics and culture, conflict, violence and peace building, inter and interreligious relation, the role of religion in the public sphere, and Arab Middle East, Southeast Asian connection. He obtained a PhD in cultural anthropology from Boston University and MA in conflict transformation from Eastern Mennonite University. He is also an author of dozens of scholarly articles and books, including Saudi Arabia and Indonesia Networks, 2019, Religious Violence and Conciliation Indonesia, 2016, and his academic articles have appeared in International Journal of ASEAN Studies, ASEAN Journal of Social Science, such as ASEAN Studies, and other journals and other books. And now we welcome Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi. Time is yours.
Thank you so much, Pak Ahmad. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
To begin with, just to test my voice, is that clear, everyone? can you hear my voice clearly? Because
Okay,
it's
clearly.
Very clear.
long
Very
distance
clear.
from Indonesia and Saudi Arabia, far away. So my apologies. I just back from teaching 4 hours teaching, so maybe my voice a little bit. Also for the title of the discussion for this morning, I was thinking this title actually yesterday, because the committee doesn't give me a specific instruction what exactly the title of the presentation should I give for this conference. So I was thinking yesterday, maybe it might be good to talk about public intellectual during this conference. So the second point is, I was thinking whether we have to talk here in English or in Indonesian language, or maybe in Maduri's languages. I'm quite confused a little bit, or maybe Javanese, because I am from Java. At the same time, I'm confused. So maybe I will mix between English and Indonesian language and Javanese language. And I believe Bu Yohana also understand a little bit about Indonesian and Javanese language. I think I'm going to mix the discussion between English and Indonesian and Javanese. I'm afraid not all many students here understand English properly. So I think it's better to mix the discussion between English and Indonesian language. Okay, the title for this presentation is about public intellectual social responsibility of Muslim scholars of Islamic higher education. This topic is, for me, before I give presentation about this topic, I think we have to understand first what exactly public intellectual is. So last night I began to search what the meaning of public intellectual, and I quote some definition from Oxford English Dictionary, and then second from Collins Dictionary. From Oxford Dictionary, we find the definition of a public intellectual is an intellectual who express views on particular topics or themes intended to be accessible to a general audience. So this is the definition of public intellectual by, I think, the Oxford English Dictionary, which is actually not really convincing. This definition for me is not really convincing and capture the problem what's happening in our society. So I'm going to explain next why. And then we came up with a definition of a public intellectual from Collins Dictionary, and I think this is much better than Oxford English Dictionary. Public intellectual is an intellectual who has become well known to the general public for a willingness to comment on current affairs. So this is the definition of a public intellectual from the Collins Dictionary. Again, I think this definition is quite much better than Oxford English Dictionary, I think. And before we discuss about my definition about public intellectual, I think we have to define first also what exactly intellectual is. And this is a huge debate within academic scholars and so forth. They have different understanding and concept about intellectual, and some believe that some scholars, they define intellectual as anyone who is thinking critically and employing a perspective that is informed and supported by systematic analysis. By this definition, that means the definition of intellectual is not only academic, it's not only Muslim scholars, not only scholars, not only writers or public speakers. It could be anyone who can think critically can be defined as a public, as an intellectual. I mean, those whose thinking informed or supported by systematic analysis, it could be intellectual. It could be politician, it could be industrialist, it could be farmer, maybe it could be musicians, maybe, or entertainers. They can be under this definition. It could be an intellectual. That means those who use critical thinking and systematic analysis. So this is the first. So, but this is why I made the second subtitle Muslim scholar. That means what I mean by intellectual. This in this discussion specifically refer to Muslim scholars in Islamic higher education, which is UIN, IAIN, or maybe from private Islamic higher education, and so on and so forth. So another thing which is we have to remember is the definition of public, what it means by public in public intellectual. So public here is that the same like, because the word public is sometimes we use for governments. So for instance, public university, government university, which is different from private university, which is non-government university. But in this case, public mean in oppositions to it could be personal or private. So just going public means it's different from the. So the public is not the word swasta in bahasa Indonesia. So public is not opposed to swasta. Public here is opposed to private in the sense of a personal. So definitions of a public intellectual I used in this study is those scholars or intellectual, I mean, who can speak publicly, critically about anything related to social issues. It could be religion, it could be politics, it could be culture, and so on and so forth. Yeah, and he talked briefly in public, in speech, in writing, and so on and so forth. So there are some characteristics of public intellectual. In this case, the first is action. If intellectual doesn't have action, do not have action, real action, that means we cannot say this a public intellectual. So, but in action means doing things, which is action, which is different from inaction. Inaction meaning quiet things. So scholars do not do anything in public to speak up about social issues and so forth. I mean, in action, but we cannot say this as part of public intellectual. So the first characteristic should be action. Okay, the second characteristic is social responsibility or social obligation. The obligation, intellectuals should have an obligation to speak up about anything, about issues, what's happening in our societies. Anything, any issues, any social problems in our societies. Because basically, public intellectual or intellectual in general, they have a responsibility. They have individual responsibility, or they have a social responsibility. So if we look at this in Bahasa Indonesia, for example, I define public intellectual as seorang intelektual yang berani berpikir kritis atau bersuara kritis. Ya. It could be use writing or speech, melalui tulisan atau melalui lecture, public lecture seperti ini. Ya. Tentang keanekaragaman persoalan yang terjadi di masyarakat. Social problem, what happened, any social problem in our societies. Ya berani bersuara kritis, berani bersuara kritis, berani berpikiran kritis, critical thinking, suara kritis, berpikiran kritis, ya. Karena menganggap berpikiran kritis dan bersuara kritis itu adalah bagian dari tanggung jawab atau kewajiban sebagai seorang sarjana atau scholar maupun sebagai kewajiban terhadap masyarakat atau publik. Jadi inilah kategori public intellectual yang saya maksud dalam diskusi sekarang ini. Nah, why do you think? I'm thinking now, why we need a public intellectual? Kenapa kita membutuhkan public intellectual sekarang ini. Karena saya berpikir there are several issues, there are several problems, social problem in our society that need our responsibility as a Muslim scholars. What I mean by Muslim scholars in this case is not only professor, academic atau dosen, tapi juga mahasiswa, students, university students, or civitas academica. Those who responsible for in this cluster, Muslim scholars is not only professors or lecturer. What I mean is it could be mahasiswa also, students also. Now, I'm thinking, kenapa kita sekarang butuh intelektual publik, khususnya di IAIN atau UIN. Beberapa problem yang saya garis bawahi kenapa kita membutuhkan public intellectual public. Pertama adalah persoalan sosial kemasyarakatan, yang tidak kondusif sekarang. Tidak kondusif karena munculnya berbagai kelompok yang super ultra konservatif, religious group ultra konservatif, close minded, intolerance, anti pluralist movement, for example, and so on and so forth. Kita tahu ini sekarang sejak Orde Baru tumbang, Indonesia sekarang banyak sekali kelompok-kelompok keagamaan yang bercorak ultra konservatif, intoleran, anti pluralis dan sebagainya, close minded dan seterusnya yang bertebaran di Indonesia. Persoalan yang kedua, kenapa itu penting kita harus menjadi public intellectual? Karena saya melihat rasisme and interreligious relation, persoalan rasisme dan kemudian relasi antar agama yang juga tidak kondusif sekarang ini antara mayoritas, minoritas, kelompok-kelompok lokal, local religions maupun minority groups and so forth yang hubungannya tidak lagi dinamis karena munculnya berbagai macam kelompok yang anti terhadap non-Muslim groups atau anti terhadap kelompok Muslim tetapi tidak memiliki satu paham atau pemahaman dengan mereka. Kemudian yang ketiga kan adanya communal violence, communal violence atau social sectarian violence yang terjadi di mana-mana. Saya melihat kita bisa tahu misalnya hasil-hasil survei dari berbagai macam lembaga tentang communal violence di Indonesia. Yang communal violence ini khususnya violence terhadap kelompok-kelompok keagamaan lokal, kelompok minoritas agama yang terjadi dari Sumatera sampai di kawasan Indonesia Timur. Ini juga sangat mengkhawatirkan, ya. Dan kemudian persoalan berikutnya adalah extremism in schools, in university, in colleges, ekstremisme yang berkembang pesat yang saya melihat radikalisme, ekstremisme yang berkembang pesat. Ini juga menjadi tantangan tersendiri yang mendorong kita harus juga menjadi intelektual publik intelektual yang berani menyuarakan kritis persoalan-persoalan keagamaan dan sosial kebudayaan dan lainnya. Kemudian yang lain yang saya garis bawahi, kenapa penting menjadi publik intelektual sekarang? Karena wacana keislaman, ini secara lebih spesifik ya, wacana keislaman yang berkembang itu, saya katakan sebagai tidak intelektualis dalam tanda petik. Jadi yang berkembang di masyarakat, karena akibat munculnya para penceramah-penceramah non-akademis, tapi populis di sebagian besar masyarakat, tapi wacana yang dikembangkan, ceramah-ceramah yang dikembangkan, tidak bernuansa intelektual, quote by quote, sehingga dari sini menimbulkan banyak problem. Berikutnya adalah muncul stigma-stigma yang kurang bagus terhadap Islam. Islam dianggap miskin tradisi intelektual dalam berpikir dan sebagainya. Semakin memperburuk citra keislaman sebagai agama yang kurang berfondasi intelektual. Nah, kita bisa tahu dari YouTube dan sebagainya ceramah-ceramah yang model-model seperti itu kita semua sudah maklum itu. Nah, jadi dalam konteks ini perebutan diskursus wacana keislaman, kenapa penting Muslim scholar ini, kenapa penting menjadi intellectual public, supaya wacana-wacana keislaman itu kita bisa turut bermain dan berproses dalam membentuk diskursus-diskursus keislaman yang intelektualis dan yang moderate dan seterusnya. Jadi supaya wacana keislaman yang berkembang itu tidak didominasi oleh kelompok-kelompok yang berhaluan radikal dan close-minded. Nah, itu yang selama ini terjadi di Indonesia yang saya perhatikan dari dari luar. Dan kemudian becoming intellectual, public intellectual juga ini penting karena ini bagian dari, tentu saja Anda sudah paham, tridharma pendidikan perguruan tinggi atau yang masuk dalam hal ini adalah sebagai bagian dari dedication to public, to society. Saya merasa ini menjadi sangat penting karena saya melihat para sivitas akademika, khususnya dosen di lingkup perguruan tinggi Islam itu belum banyak yang menjadi intelektual public intelektual. Meskipun saya melihat sudah ada, tetapi bukan tidak cukup untuk membendung laju intoleransi, anti pluralis movement dan seterusnya yang terjadi di Indonesia. Saya melihat dari jarak jauh, mungkin bisa dikoreksi ini dari para pimpinan UIN Sunan Ampel, Surabaya. Saya melihat dosen sekarang sibuk nulis untuk mengejar pangkat, misalnya jabatan, sibuk nulis skopus, sibuk nulis ngurusi admin, sibuk ngurusi hal-hal yang itu penting tentu saja sebagai seorang akademik. Sehingga dari sini mereka kurang begitu peka terhadap sebagai seorang intelektual, sarjana, tanggung jawab sosial, individual sebagai seorang sarjana dan intelektual, karena disibukkan dengan persoalan-persoalan administrasi dan tuntutan untuk publikasi, nulis supaya naik pangkat atau dapat gelar ini itu dan seterusnya. Nah, karena itu saya melihat sarjana Muslim di IAIN atau UIN itu lebih banyak diam. Yang saya sebutkan dari awal tadi, inaction, belum banyak yang action. Nah, karena itu karena diam berarti inaction, berarti belum masuk kategori public intelektual yang betul-betul harus speak up, harus bersuara lantang melihat persoalan-persoalan yang terjadi di masyarakat, baik persoalan keagamaan, kebudayaan, kepolitikan dan seterusnya. Jadi saya melihat para dosen dan pimpinan khususnya di IAIN atau UIN yang menjadi topik sekarang ini belum banyak yang berbicara sebagai seorang intelektual publik ya. Meskipun dia sudah bergelar guru besar misalnya atau apa, tidak menggunakan otoritas sebagai guru besar itu untuk berbicara di ruang-ruang publik untuk merebut diskursus keislaman, keagamaan yang sekarang banyak dikuasai oleh kelompok-kelompok itu lewat YouTube dan seterusnya. Saya melihat beberapa guru besar, bahkan kalau sudah mencapai guru besar, ini mohon maaf, ini kritik saya, mohon maaf, ini bisa yang mau marah sama saya silahkan, dan juga silahkan, saya nggak peduli, saya nggak tinggal di Indonesia. Jadi pada guru besar sudah mencapai gelar guru besar, harusnya itu dijadikan sebagai modal intelektual untuk semakin bersuara kritis di publik ya. Jangan setelah mendapat guru besar, malah yang terjadi adalah santai-santai, main musik, leha-leha, kurang memiliki spirit untuk melakukan perubahan sosial di masyarakat. Nah, saya bayangkan buat saya sarjana Islam, sarjana Muslim itu, apalagi IAIN dan UIN, ini betul-betul menjadi sumber intelektual yang seharusnya dominan dalam konteks keindonesiaan, keislaman Indonesia, supaya diskursus wacana keislaman itu bisa justru yang paling otoritatif kan justru seharusnya dari IAIN atau UIN, bukan dari kelompok-kelompok mereka yang tidak memiliki background akademik sebagaimana para sarjana-sarjana dari IAIN atau UIN. Nah, kalau yang otoritatif itu diam, tidak speak up, tidak banyak berbicara di publik, paling hanya menulis untuk kepentingan Skopus, untuk naik pangkat dan seterusnya, atau menulis setelah peristiwa itu terjadi dan seterusnya. Jadi kita nanti lama-lama nanti persoalan diskursus keislaman, keagamaan akan berubah di Indonesia. Nah, sekarang sudah mulai, tanda-tandanya sudah mulai nampak di situ. Nah, ini tanggung jawab untuk bagi para sarjana Muslim, bukan hanya sibuk menulis jurnal-jurnal yang bagus, tetapi juga harus memiliki keberanian bersuara kritis, speak up untuk menyuarakan persoalan-persoalan global di masyarakat. Saya bayangkan misalnya, karena saya background di antropologi, misalnya dulu di Amerika ada Franz Boas, pendiri antropologi Amerika yang juga bersuara melawan rasisme di Amerika, karena dulu iklimnya di Amerika adalah iklim rasisme. Jadi kelompok-kelompok ilmuwan di Amerika dulu hampir semuanya adalah rasis dalam pengertian rasis dan etnosentrik pada saat yang bersamaan, dalam pengertian bahwa mereka menganggap the West is better than the rest, dan non-West itu adalah karakter intelektual saintis dulu pada abad 19 dan awal abad 20. Dan Franz Boas berdiri melawan rasisme itu, melawan etnosentrisme itu, berdiri sebagai seorang intelektual publik. Nah, saya harapkan karena juga begitu, sama dengan hal-hal yang lain juga seperti itu, seharusnya kelompok sarjana Muslim ini harus menjadi public intelektual. Atau dulu misalnya Theodor Husbach, seorang intelektual yang sangat populer di Amerika, yang kemudian bersama Martin Luther King bersama-sama menyuarakan menentang terhadap rasisme di Amerika misalnya dan seterusnya. Jadi menjadi intelektual public intelektual itu adalah bukan hanya tanggung jawab seorang sarjana Muslim terhadap masyarakat, tetapi juga tanggung jawab sebagai seorang intelektual atau sarjana itu sendiri adalah harus menjadi seorang public intelektual. Nah, harapan saya teman-teman dari UIN Sunan Ampel ini, karena Sunan Ampel ini salah satu UIN terbaik di Indonesia ya. Dari sinilah produksi intelektual itu muncul, dari sini banyak sekali skalar-skalar muncul dari UIN ini. Nah, saya harapkan para sarjana-sarjana yang berkualitas dari UIN Sunan Ampel itu bisa mewarnai diskursus keislaman yang berkembang di Indonesia. Saya sangat berharap sekali UIN Sunan Ampel, Jogja, Jakarta bisa menjadi pionir di bidang intelektual, wacana keislaman, dan para Muslim scholars itu menjadi public intelektual, sehingga wacana keislaman bisa merebut wacana keislaman, tidak dikuasai oleh kelompok-kelompok yang close-minded, intoleran, dan pro terhadap radikalisme, ekstremisme, dan terorisme dan seterusnya. Saya kira itu paparan singkat saya, Pak Ahmad. Jadi sekali lagi saya mohon maaf karena ini habis ngajar 4 jam non-stop, suara saya sudah mau hilang sepertinya ini. Mudah-mudahan ada manfaatnya, karena topik besarnya juga saya tidak paham betul, makanya saya beri tema yang mungkin ada sedikit manfaat untuk kita bicarakan bersama-sama, supaya dari sini saya mendorong dengan sangat for example sarjana-sarjana Muslim mulai sekarang jangan hanya diem di kampus sibuk ngurusi publikasi dan seterusnya, tapi juga harus betul-betul aktif engage di public discussion tentang khususnya tentang keislaman, tentang wacana-wacana keislaman supaya lebih berwarna. Islam itu lebih berwarna, tidak hanya dikuasai oleh kelompok-kelompok itu saja yang justru akan berdampak buruk kepada Islam itu sendiri sebagai agama yang sebetulnya sangat banyak unsur-unsur intelektualismenya di dalamnya. Saya kira itu, Pak. Mohon maaf kalau ada hal-hal yang kurang berkenan. Mungkin ada satu dua yang mau bertanya juga saya persilakan, tapi itu poin-poin yang ingin saya sampaikan untuk sementara. Terima kasih. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Baik, terima kasih Profesor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi. Ada 3 poin penting, 3 keyword that described by Professor relating to public intellectual. The first is critical thinking, the real action, and social interaction. Sebagai sesi akhir dari forum kita, I will read several questions written in the chat room. There are 4 questions, 2 questions to Professor Bianto, 1 question for Professor Sumanto, and then another question to Professor Johanna Pings. The question from Lina to Professor Bianto: what is your opinion about the views of people who have verifiable opinion that say that the policies in anticipation of corona is only a legitimacy of the desire of these people in power? The second question to Prof. Bianto is, what strategies can be done to actualize the principle of religious moderation so that not only in discourse? This is from Wilda. Saya kira langsung dijawab untuk Profesor Bianto, so time is less to answer.
Okay, thank you. Really, I enjoy with Professor Sumanto presentation, yeah, especially his critique to public intellectual, include the professors. Okay, the first I want to respond for the questions. The first, what is important is to understand that it is not the religion that it is being moderated, but the understanding or interpretation or religious teachings. I mean bahwa yang dimoderasi itu bukan agamanya, bukan ajaran agamanya, ya, tetapi adalah pemahaman atau penafsiran terhadap ajaran agama itu. Nah, ini yang sangat, I think it is important views. Yes. The second, because we are in higher education, thus enlightening, learning, we can practice the values of religious moderation. So educators must teach the values of religious moderation to students. It is I think the second point for me. Dalam kaitan ini yang sangat penting adalah bagaimana para pendidik, para dosen mengajarkan ajaran agama yang mencerahkan kepada para mahasiswa, ya. Like Profesor Sumanto said, we must realize the face of Islam as rahmatan lil alamin, not Islam marah, but Islam ramah. there are differences among Islam ramah and Islam marah. And the second, in addition, we can spread the values of moderation through places of worship. I think also families, religious organizations like the Indonesian Ulama Council, MUI, Muhammadiyah, Nahdlatul Ulama, and so on. And I think it is important for the students is youth organizations. Jadi kita bisa melakukan internalisasi nilai-nilai moderasi itu melalui tempat-tempat ibadah, ya, lewat khotib-khotib yang tadi disinggung oleh Profesor Sumanto tadi itu, juga melalui keluarga, ya, keteladanan dari orang tua, pendidikan orang tua, religious organizations melalui organisasi-organisasi keagamaan, dan juga melalui youth organization, organisasi kepemudaan. Meski harus diakui sekarang ini organisasi kepemudaan banyak yang terkonotasi dengan kepentingan politik dan kekuasaan, sehingga nyaris there is no critics of youth organizations yang kita bisa lihat seperti itu. Nah, terkait dengan pertanyaan yang pertama tadi itu, saya kira ada di beberapa presentasi saya bahwa kita memang harus menempatkan agama dan sains above anything, ya. Religious moderation is also in line with the teaching of using rational thoughts and scientific approaches to responding to the challenges of religious life during the pandemic era. Kepentingan politik, ekonomi harus tunduk pada pendekatan agama, pendekatan ilmu, supaya pandemic era ini segera berakhir. Atau setidaknya supaya era pandemi ini berubah menjadi endemi. Nah, ketika era pandemi ini berubah menjadi endemi, maka kita akan melihat coronavirus itu as penyakit flu, ya, penyakit batuk, dan kita bisa lebih bersahabat dengan coronavirus, gitu ya. Karena itu penting ditunggu bagaimana UIN sudah nampel the next semester, ya. Apakah ada keberanian untuk misalnya pembelajaran tatap muka, tidak lagi pembelajaran lewat daring yang menurut beberapa survei itu sudah terbukti sangat tidak efektif, ya. I think that is my response, Mr. Ahmad Siddiq, and I take the time for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. I will read another question or two questions for Professor Yohana before, in the end, we will deliver the question for Professor Sumanto. There is a question from Ataila Umar to Professor Yohana. Someone said that radicalism is caused by teaching Arabic language in many schools and pesantren. What do you think? I think this is a case of one statement here from Indonesian intellectual. And the second is, what do you think about Occidentalism? You can answer the question. Thank you.
Yeah. About the Arabic language, I mean, the context of this idea is that the Arabic language is usually, teaching Arabic in a certain way is usually equated with Salafi ideas. And then Salafi ideas are seen as leading to radicalization and ultimately maybe to jihadism. I mean, objectively, this is not necessary. I mean, first of all, you can teach Arabic without being Salafi. You can also teach Arabic in a Salafi way and not teach jihadism. So this is, I mean, this is just a bit simplistic. I mean, obviously in Indonesia in the last years, there has been this discourse which tries to juxtapose like Islam Arab, Islam Nusantara, and they are like completely different things. But there are several problems with this. I mean, first of all, Islam Arab is not the same thing as Wahhabism. So there are many different ways of being Arab and Muslim. And there are also very many different ways of being Indonesian and Muslim. And there's a big tradition of Arabic Islamic scholarship. And if you teach Arabic, you simply give people the means to understand the Quran and also understand all the Arabic tafsir literature and so on. So it doesn't necessarily have to lead to radicalization, but at the same time, I mean, obviously it's helpful if you also teach people to contextualize the things they are reading in the Quran and tafsir and so on. For example, a few years ago, there was this big debate in Indonesia about Al-Ma'idah 51, La tattakhidhul yahuda wa nasara awliya, and so on. And then, of course, you could just tell people, okay, it means don't take the Jews and Christians as leaders or as allies or as helpers or whatever. I mean, in Indonesia, it was usually leaders, pemimpin. This was, I think, the main debate. Or you could actually have a discussion of what the term awliya meant in the Quran originally, the different dimensions, the context in which this verse occurred, and so on. And in that case, it's not really a problem of Arabic or not Arabic or anything. It's more like a problem of the understanding and the context that are being taught. So the other question, Occidentalism and Orientalism, yes, I know. I mean, I'm working in a field that has a very problematic history. And of course, we are having a lot of discussions about that history. Like Orientalism as a discipline was very closely connected to colonialism. In Germany, not quite as much as in the Netherlands or in Britain. But still, I mean, yeah, the history of the discipline was mostly based on the idea that the Orient is different and it's also inferior to the West, to Europe. I don't think this is the dominant view in Orientalism today, but still, of course, the question is like, why do Europeans start like studying all these other cultures, and isn't this still like a kind of otherizing, seeing them as different and also as something that we can explore, that we have the freedom to do, I mean, to write about, to talk about, and so on. I think this is a very legitimate criticism. Partly, I think it's just very hard to change the structure of universities. So it's, I think, for example, it would make complete sense to teach the history of the Arab world or the history of Southeast Asia simply as part of our history departments in Germany. But it's probably not going to happen simply because the structures are so entrenched, so strong. Like we have all these professors of German history and European history, and they don't want to give up their, their positions to teach Asian history and so on. So in a way, I'm being very pragmatic. I think like we just work with the history we have and with the structure we have, and we have to be aware of it, and we also have to be aware of the problem. And the other thing is I think that today it's just we have very good opportunities to actually talk to each other. So like, for example, here I'm, the audience is Indonesian, the colleagues who are talking here are Indonesian. So I'm working in a world where we are no longer just Europeans talking about Indonesia or about Islam or about the Arab world, but we are also talking with colleagues from Indonesia, with colleagues from the Arab world, with non-Muslims, Muslims. All the other people in my team at the moment are Muslims. So we have a very close collaboration, and it's simply this strict division, you know, non-Muslim studying Islam and Muslim studying Islam is more and more starting to disappear. I think this is a good thing. And I also think that tafsir studies and translation studies are very well suited to this, because we don't have any, you know, if I study the history of tafsir, it isn't really important if I believe in, you know, whether the Quran is from God or something, because we can all agree that the tafsir works have been written by humans, by scholars, to express their view of the Quran at a particular time, and we can ask interesting questions and have a discussion about this, regardless of what we believe. Yeah, and this is a very good experience. It's very different from the time when I started doing Islamic studies in the 1990s, when in Germany it was still a very exotic thing to do. And it was like a bunch of German people talking about the Arab world, the Muslim world, and so on. But it was starting to change. Like I said, Professor Wild, for example, he brought in Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. And we were starting to read works like by Fazlur Rahman, by Farid Ishaq, etc. So more and more it was like, it's not just non-Muslim scholarship about Islam, but it's also Muslim scholarship about Islam. And I think this is the direction we need to take in order to get beyond this problem of Orientalism, and not just think like, okay, because I'm a European non-Muslim, my voice on Islam is like more important or more authoritative. The opposite, I think, is true. I think it's very important to listen actually to the people who live in these regions and who do their research there. And so that's also why I'm working a lot with Indonesian colleagues.
Thank you, Professor. And question to Professor Sumanto. Two questions from Wilda. The first question, how are the efforts to form a public intellectual foundation for the academic community from the millennial young generation? And the second question is, what is the shape of the role of lectures in improving public intellectual so that mentality and enthusiasm appear for social change? Is it not enough with writing in the form of solving social problems? Silakan, Prof.
Okay, thank you so much. I think I saw one question is not. I think one question about.
Oh, okay. One question from Atoila
about why the teaching of the Salafis in social media has so many fans. I'm going to answer this question first before I answer the question from. I forgot the name. First, this is a question from Atoila, yeah, Atoila Umar. A question about why Tarjama of the Salafis in social media has so many fans. Actually, it's not only Muslim cleric, Salafi Muslim cleric that who have many fans in YouTube and other social media. I think I saw many NOKIs or young KIs. They also have many fans in YouTube. I saw. So this is not only from the Salafi ustad or preachers, but also from non-Salafis. Also, they have huge fans. It is of course this depends on us. Maybe because the drama is good, interesting, maybe funny little bit. So they are it's interesting to hear, interesting to follow. And of course there are many reasons, yeah. Or maybe because of this particular cleric or preacher has connected to particular organization. So, for example, if you think you are a member of Nahdlatul Ulama, and then you will follow your cleric, your Muslim cleric, your PIs, for example, you will search from NO preacher, which is also very plenty. We can find many in YouTube and others. But if you might be non-Nahdlatul Ulama, you might be non-member of the Nahdlatul Ulama, maybe you are not interested to listen, to hear the drama or preaching from the Kiai or members of the Nahdlatul Ulama. So I think I think there are several reasons. It's not only Salafis in social media who has many fans. Non-Salafis also they have many fans actually. Of course, all of these things has many reasons and background. It might be as closely associated with organizations, or might be closely associated with political interest. It could be political interest because many public preacher is actually strongly connected to several political groups or political organizations. So those who follow particular political group, political organization, they will follow ustad or preacher that they have the same view with them. It could be like this, or it could be because the content of the ceramah or preaching, it could be fit to their need, what they need in their daily life. So there are many backgrounds. In short, there are many backgrounds, there are many reasons, and Salafis in social media, of course, they have so many fans. Of course, there are several historical background. If you look at the emergent rise of Salafis, those followers of the Salafi, of course, they will not listen to the preacher from non-Salafi. So this is why they also have many fans in social media, and this is actually common. It's not only happened in Indonesia, but also in many places in other societies, in other countries also have the same tendency. Those Salafis will follow Salafi preacher, those non-Salafi will follow non-Salafi preacher, no matter the content of the preacher, no matter the quality of the preacher. It sometimes happen like this. It's not because of the quality. It's sometimes because of strong emotional connection, emotional relationships between the people and the preacher. So again, this is not only the case only for Salafis, but also non-Salafis. For the second question, which is from Wilda, is about for the millennial generation. I think the younger generation is not only from millennial, but we call it now. How do they call now? Generasi Z or Z generation is not only millennial. Is already past. I think now is the Z generation, generasi Z. And it is much more difficult to teach the generasi Z, or Z generations. I think one thing which is very important is since the beginning, sejak awal, we have to teach them students or younger generation the significance of being live in tolerance, the significance of being live in harmony with other people, with societies, and so forth. I think we have to inject this since the beginning. So and then in the future, the student can think about the beauty of living together with other people in diversity. But the problem is it's not easy either, because banyak mahasiswa itu, students itu yang berpikir, younger generation, that they think about how to get work, how to get job after the finishes the school, bagaimana mendapatkan pekerjaan. So they are thinking about employment, about job, about profession. So they do not think about the quality of education, quality of to seek knowledge, quality to gain skills, and so on and so forth. So it's really important on one hand, but also it's really difficult to achieve because the younger generation mostly is more pragmatic, lebih suka setelah berpikir tentang bagaimana pekerjaan, bagaimana itu, daripada berpikir untuk menjadi seorang intelektual sarjana, apalagi seorang intelektual publik. Jadi fondasi itu tidak akan bisa tertanam di kalangan mahasiswa milenial, di kalangan generasi milenial maupun generasi Z, kalau mereka sejak awal sudah tidak berpikiran kritis. They do not use critical thinking, do not use systematic analysis, tidak dibiasakan untuk berpikiran cerdas, mengevaluasi social problems, and on and on and on. And ini based on my experience in the past, when I was undergraduate student in IAIN Wali Songo in Semarang. Now it's become UIN Semarang. In the past, I didn't get any knowledge and others from the university because lecturer, they only teach using diktat, and people and professor or lecturer, they only teach student how to finish fast, how to get job after finish their study and so on. They do not teach students how to optimize their mind critically, to think critically about society, how to analyze social problem critically, and so on and so forth. So critical thinking bukan menjadi intellectual habits of my generation in the past. So I think now it's quite different because many professors now have been trained in diverse multi-university, having doctorate degree in others. So I believe now is quite different. The nature, the cultures of education, intellectualism, I think is different from the past. So this is the most important thing, is we have to teach students critical thinking, to analyze social problems critically, and so on and so forth. So which is different from my experience in the past, because I dissatisfied with university, so I use non-formal educational forums to analyze things, to write things, and so on and so forth. So I hope for UIN Sunan Ampel, para dosen, para profesor mengajarkan critical thinking ini, and also systematic analysis ini, supaya mahasiswa baik generasi Z maupun generasi milenial dibiasakan untuk berpikir kritis, dan harus menjadikan student based learning, teaching learning process. Teaching learning process itu harus berbasis kepada student. The student, we should student itu sebagai subjek, ya, not sebagai objek, sebagai partner diskusi, dan support. Jangan menggunakan monolog, lecturing, but we have to train students to think critically by using multiple method teaching approach, and so forth. So saya berharap ini ada di UIN Sunan Ampel. Jadikan student sebagai subjek, partner diskusi, critical thinking, supaya mereka begitu lulus ready engage in public, dan kemudian menjadi intelektual publik, sarjana publik diharapkan, ya, kalau mereka memiliki pikiran-pikiran, di training pikiran-pikiran kritis sejak awal, bukan di training bagaimana pekerja nanti, bagaimana mendapatkan PNS, apalagi ini otaknya otak PNS, kalau sudah belajar nanti bagaimana dapat PNS, bagaimana dapat ASN di Kementerian Agama, sudah selesai. Kalau sudah begini itu selesai. Pikirnya harus lebih luas dari itu, ya. Lebih perspektifnya harus lebih luas daripada sekedar employment job dan seterusnya. Nah, kemudian apakah writing is not enough to solve problems? Saya kira tidak enough. Kalau menurut amatan saya, because literasi itu masih banyak di Indonesia. Tingkat illiteracy di Indonesia itu masih cukup tinggi. Budaya, reading cultures itu masih sangat mengkhawatirkan di Indonesia. Jadi budayanya masih budaya ngomong, lisan, oral culture. Budayanya bukan budaya membaca. Writing itu kan bagus, is good for people, for society who has reading habit, reading culture. Tetapi kalau tidak memiliki reading habit, reading culture, writing itu tidak akan sampai ke publik yang lebih luas. Jadi saya contohkan begini, misalnya para profesor, para dosen menulis di academic journals, very good, excellent academic journal. Siapa yang membaca academic journal itu? Paling reviewers editor in chief atau paling dosen yang butuh bikin tugas atau mahasiswa yang bikin tugas. Itu sangat terbatas sekali, readernya is very limited, sangat terbatas. Jadi target audience dengan writing itu juga sangat terbatas. Tetapi kalau speech, ceramah, bicara itu bisa sampai banyak audiennya. Ya, sampai banyak karena tradisi mendengar, tradisi lisan itu masih kuat di Indonesia. Nah, karena itu kenapa penceramah itu bisa populer, penceramah itu bisa karena tradisi masyarakatnya tradisi mendengar, bukan tradisi membaca. Itu masih dominan di our culture, Indonesian culture. The tendency, the dominance of Indonesian cultures itu belum di reading culture. Jadi masih tradisi mendengar, orang ceramah, bukan membaca tulisan. Nah, membaca tulisan itu adalah sudah tradisi yang cukup tinggi, ya. Membaca tulisan itu sudah, kalau kita menggunakan teori evolusi dalam tanda petik, membaca tulisan itu sudah lumayan cukup tinggi. Jangankan non mahasiswa aja tradisi reading habitnya rendah, apalagi membayangkan non mahasiswa saja reading habitnya akan rendah. Mereka baru baca mungkin kalau mau nulis skripsi atau nulis tesis atau tugas. Di luar itu reading habitnya kan masih rendah. Coba lihat aja perpus UIN itu ada orangnya nggak? Perpus UIN itu mungkin ada 1-2 orang, ada lagi. Jadi itu bisa dijadikan sebagai indikator bahwa reading habit itu belum menjadi our culture, dan ini menjadi tanggung jawab yang besar ke depannya supaya reading habit itu betul-betul menjadi culture Muslim societies. Nah, saya katakan, apakah writing in the form of writing to find problem solving in our society is enough? Jawaban saya is not enough. It's sufficient. It's not sufficient. Yeah. So this is why I encourage Muslim scholars in Islamic higher education to be public intellectual. It's not enough to be Muslim scholars, right? Nulis. Sekarang ini tidak cukup. Kalau hanya itu saja, nanti Islamic discourse, public Islamic discourse akan terus dikuasai oleh kelompok-kelompok yang bukan dari Islamic higher education, yang justru seharusnya mengontrol dan mendominasi wacana-wacana Islamic discourse supaya tidak kemana-mana diskursusnya itu. Nah, sekarang terjadi di mana-mana karena Islamic discourse sekarang berkembang sangat tidak intelektualis dalam tanda petik, karena saya melihat tidak banyak dari sarjana-sarjana Muslim YN atau UIN itu yang betul-betul berperan sebagai public intellectual. Mereka masih menjadi private intellectual, hanya skupnya terbatas di YN, UIN dan sebagainya, belum speak up, reaching out ke publik, ikut bertarung, mendiskusikan persoalan-persoalan yang berkembang di masyarakat. Jadi supaya Islam itu lebih berwibawa, lebih bernuansa intelektual, tidak banyak diremehkan dan dijadikan sebagai bahan polokan oleh kelompok-kelompok yang tidak begitu appreciate terhadap Islam. Jadi tanggung jawab Muslim scholars di Islamic higher education itu salah satunya. Saya kira itu, Pak, jawaban singkat dari saya. Jadi even though of course saya selalu men-encourage Muslim scholar untuk menulis itu otomatis, no question about this, but writing is not enough. We have to speak up frankly to public, karena persoalan rasisme, ethnocentrism, radikalisme, ekstremisme, terorisme, intoleran, anti-pluralist movement, all many things happen in Indonesia. Kalau kita diam, quiet, not speak up, sibuk ngurusi thing like this, maka beberapa tahun kemudian bisa dilihat itu wacana keislamannya akan seperti apa. Sekarang kita beruntung masih ada kiai-kiai muda yang luar biasa sebagai intelektual publik, kiai publik, tapi itu masih juga belum cukup. Intelektual dari IAIN yang UIN yang jumlahnya banyak ini harus harus berani tampil ke depan sebagai public intellectual in the future. Saya kira itu Pak, mohon maaf kalau ada mungkin tidak pas untuk itu jawaban saya. Terima kasih.
Baik, terima kasih Profesor Sumanto. Thank you very much for your presentation and answer. Bapak Ibu yang saya hormati, we are now in the end of our session this afternoon. I'm sure 2 hours is not enough to discuss this interesting topic on Islamic literature and Muslim society and public intellectual, but surely we have learned and got a lot of insight from all speakers. Thank you for Professor Johanna Ping. Thank you for Professor Bianto and Professor Sumanto Al-Qurtubi. Many things for your insight. Also, thank to all participants yang sudah sabar sampai 2 jam lebih ya, for your attention. Thank to the committee and all Sivitas Akademika di Fakultas Suludin dan Filsafat UNJ Surabaya. I hope we will see all of you again in our next ICMAS in October 2023, inshallah. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Terima kasih Pak. Thank you so much Pak Bianto ya Pak Siti.
Thank you
Pak
Sumanto.
Thank you.
Ini di UIN belum offline ya Pak Bianto? Belum offline ya ngajarnya?
Belum.
Oh, di kampusku sudah offline sekarang. Sudah
gitu
offline.
Ya.
Sudah 1 semester ini mulai offline. Jadi tidak daring lagi. Makanya saya tadi lari dari kampus. Sudah offline sekarang. Syaratnya harus 2 vaksin. Sudah vaksin 2. Mereka bisa registrasi itu online. Sekarang sudah offline semua, nggak cuma kampus tapi juga high school, sudah banyak
ya.
offline.
Sudah publik
ini ya. Vaksin apa saja ya?
Oh, bukan yang Cina itu, apa namanya?
Oh, bukan yang Cina itu.
Apa namanya itu?
Sinovac.
Enggak Sinovac, tapi yang
Pfizer ya.
Moderna
bukan. Johnson
ya,
Johnson ya.
sama
Astra.
itu.